The hot summer sun beat down on David's driveway as he stood there, hands on his hips, staring at his old red Mustang. The car had been his pride and joy for over 15 years. But lately, it was giving him nothing but trouble. Every morning, when he tried to start it, the engine would cough and sputter like an old man with a bad cold. Sometimes it would start, sometimes it wouldn't. Today was one of those days when it just refused to cooperate. David wiped the sweat from his forehead and sighed deeply. He had already taken the car to 3 different mechanics in town, and each one had given him a quote that made his wallet cry. The first guy wanted $2,000 just to look at it properly. The second mechanic said the engine needed to be completely rebuilt, which would cost more than what the car was worth. The third one just shook his head and suggested David should sell it for parts. But this wasn't just any car to David. This 1967 Mustang held memories that money couldn't buy. He remembered the day he bought it from an estate sale 15 years ago. The elderly woman selling it had tears in her eyes as she handed him the keys. She said it belonged to her late husband, and she hoped someone would take good care of it. David had promised her he would, and he meant every word. And now, standing in his driveway feeling defeated, David wondered if he had let her down. Maybe it was time to give up on the old girl. Maybe the mechanics were right, and it wasn't worth fixing anymore. But something deep inside him refused to accept that. There had to be someone out there who could help him. Just as David was about to head back inside, his neighbor Tom walked over from next door. Tom was in his 60s, retired, and always seemed to know everyone in town. He had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years and was like a walking directory of local services. Still having trouble with the Mustang? Tom asked, nodding toward the car. Yeah, David replied, kicking at a small stone on the driveway. I'm starting to think it's hopeless. 3 mechanics have looked at it, and they all want crazy money to fix it. Tom scratched his chin thoughtfully. You know, there's someone new in town, been here about 6 months, does really good work, and the prices are fair. My buddy Jerry had his old truck fixed by this person, and he couldn't stop talking about how thorough and honest they were. David's ears perked up. Really? What's the name of the shop? Actually, it's not a shop, Tom said with a slight smile. This person works out of their garage and makes house calls. Very professional, though. Has all the right tools and really knows what they're doing. Want me to get you the number? David nodded eagerly. At this point, he was willing to try anyone. That would be great, Tom. Thanks. Within an hour, David had made the call and scheduled an appointment for the next day. The voice on the phone was professional and friendly, asking detailed questions about the car's symptoms and promising to bring the right tools for a proper diagnosis. The next morning, David was up early, nervously pacing around his kitchen and checking the time every few minutes. He had cleaned the garage and moved some things around to give the mechanic better access to the car. He even swept the driveway, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe he just wanted to make a good impression. At exactly 9 o'clock, a clean white pickup truck pulled into David's driveway. David watched from his window as someone got out of the truck and began unloading tools from the back. When the person turned around and started walking toward his front door, David did a complete double take. The mechanic was a woman, probably in her early 30s, with short brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore clean work clothes and safety boots, and she carried herself with a confidence that immediately caught David's attention. This wasn't what he had expected at all. David opened the door before she could knock. You must be the mechanic Tom recommended, he said, trying not to sound surprised. That's right, she replied with a warm smile, extending her hand for a firm handshake. I'm Lisa. You must be David. I'm here about the Mustang. As they walked toward the car, David found himself stealing glances at Lisa. She moved with purpose, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Her toolbox was incredibly organized, with every tool in its proper place. Even her truck was spotless, both inside and out. Beautiful car, Lisa said as they approached the Mustang. 67, right? These are special machines when they're running properly. Yeah, that's right, David replied, impressed that she could tell the year just by looking at it. I bought it 15 years ago, and it's been great until recently. Now it's just giving me all kinds of problems. Lisa walked around the car slowly, examining it from different angles. She looked at the tires, checked the exhaust pipe, and peered through the windows at the interior. Then she popped the hood and leaned in to examine the engine. David watched as she studied the engine with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. She didn't just glance at things like the other mechanics had done. Instead, she carefully examined each component, touching certain parts and listening to others. She even pulled out a small flashlight to look into areas that were hard to see. "Tell me about the symptoms," Lisa said without looking up from the engine. "When did the problem start, and what exactly does it do?" David described the sputtering, the difficulty starting, and the inconsistent performance. Lisa nodded as she listened, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed she was really paying attention to every detail. After about 10 minutes of examination, Lisa straightened up and looked at David with a serious expression. "This isn't just about the carburetor like those other mechanics probably told you," she said. "Someone's been working on this car recently, and honestly, they didn't know what they were doing." David felt his heart sink. "How can you tell? See this? Here." Lisa pointed to a specific area of the engine. "This wiring has been redone, but it's not connected properly. And over here, someone replaced this part, but they used the wrong type. It's like they were guessing instead of actually diagnosing the problems." Lisa continued her examination for another few minutes, then stood up and wiped her hands on a clean rag. "The good news is that I can definitely fix it, and it won't cost you anywhere near what those other places quoted you." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Really? You're sure?" "Absolutely," Lisa replied with confidence. "But there's something else you should know about this particular car." David raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Lisa looked at the Mustang thoughtfully, then back at David. "I've worked on a lot of classic cars, and there's something about this one that's different. I noticed some things during my examination that aren't typical for a regular civilian vehicle." "From this era? Different how?" David asked, his curiosity growing. "Let me do the repairs first," Lisa said. "But while I'm working, I'd like to take a closer look at some of the components. There might be more to this car's history than you realize." David nodded, though he wasn't sure what she meant. He had owned the car for 15 years and thought he knew everything about it. What could this stranger possibly see that he had missed all this time? As Lisa began unloading more tools from her truck, David couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet morning was about to become much more interesting than he had expected. Over the next 2 days, David found himself checking on Lisa's progress every hour or so. He would bring her cold water and sandwiches, partly because he wanted to be helpful, but mostly because he was fascinated by watching her work. She approached every task with the precision of a surgeon, carefully removing each part and examining it before deciding what needed to be fixed or replaced. What struck David most was how methodical Lisa was. Unlike the other mechanics who had rushed through their inspections, she took her time with everything. She would hold certain parts up to the light, turning them at different angles as if she was looking for something specific. Sometimes she would pause her work completely and just stare at a component for several minutes, lost in thought. On the first day, David noticed Lisa taking photos with her phone. At first, he assumed she was documenting the repair process, which seemed professional and smart. But as he watched more carefully, he realized she wasn't photographing the obvious problems. Instead, she was focusing on parts that looked perfectly fine to him. She took pictures of serial numbers, manufacturer stamps, and small details that David had never even noticed before. "Finding everything you need?" David asked during one of his check-ins, trying to sound casual while his curiosity was eating him alive. "Oh yes, the parts are all coming together nicely," Lisa replied. But David noticed she quickly put her phone away. The carburetor was definitely the main culprit. "Just like I thought. Should have her purring like a kitten by tomorrow afternoon." But David could tell there was more to it than that. Lisa would sometimes stop working entirely and just walk around the car, examining it from different angles with an expression that looked almost puzzled. It was as if she was trying to solve a mystery that went beyond just fixing the engine. On the second day, Lisa's behavior became even more curious. She spent the morning working on the obvious repairs, but in the afternoon, she started focusing on areas of the car that seemed to have nothing to do with the engine problems. She crawled underneath the vehicle with a flashlight, examining the undercarriage more thoroughly than any mechanic David had ever seen. "Is everything okay under there?" David called out, lying on his back on the concrete driveway. "Just being thorough," came Lisa's muffled reply from beneath the car. "Sometimes you find things that aren't obvious from above." David could hear her moving around under there, and occasionally he heard the sound of metal tapping against metal, as if she was testing different parts. At one point, he heard her take a sharp breath, like someone who had just discovered something unexpected. When Lisa finally slid out from under the car, her face was streaked with grease, but her eyes had a look that David couldn't quite identify. It was somewhere between excitement and concern, like someone who had found exactly what they were looking for, but wasn't sure if it was good news or bad news. "David," Lisa said, wiping her hands on a rag, "can you tell me more about where you bought this car? You mentioned it was an estate sale." The question caught David off guard. "Yeah, about 15 years ago." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about its history," Lisa replied. But David could tell she was being evasive. "Do you remember anything about the previous owner?" David thought back to that day 15 years ago. It was an elderly woman, maybe in her 70s. She seemed really sad about selling it, said it belonged to her late husband, and she hoped someone would take good care of it. She didn't mention much else about him, just that he had passed away recently. Lisa nodded thoughtfully, as if this information confirmed something she had already suspected. Did she mention what her husband did for a living, or anything about his background? "Not really," David said, starting to feel a bit uncomfortable with all the questions. "Lisa, is there something wrong with the car? Something I should know about?" Instead of answering directly, Lisa walked back to the engine bay and pointed to a specific area near the back of the engine block. "David, I need to remove this distributor to complete the repair, but there's something behind it that I think you should see first." David moved closer as Lisa carefully loosened the bolts, holding the distributor in place. As she worked, she explained that this particular component was located in an area that would normally never be accessed unless someone was doing major engine work or a complete rebuild. Most mechanics would simply work around it rather than removing it entirely. "The thing is," Lisa continued as she worked, "I noticed some scratches and wear patterns that suggested this part had been removed before, probably more than once. That's unusual for a car this age, especially in this location." As Lisa lifted the distributor away, David could see into a small space behind where it had been mounted. At first glance, it just looked like more engine components and metal surfaces. But Lisa reached in with a small flashlight and illuminated something that made David's breath catch in his throat. There, tucked into a space that was completely hidden unless you knew exactly where to look, was a small metal plate. It was about the size of a business card and appeared to be deliberately placed there. Not just a random piece of metal that had somehow gotten stuck during manufacturing. Lisa's hands were shaking slightly as she carefully removed the plate from its hiding spot. The metal was tarnished with age, but David could clearly see that it had some kind of engraving on it. There were numbers, letters, and what looked like some kind of official symbol or insignia. "What is that?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa held the plate up to the light, examining it closely. Her face had gone completely pale, and for the first time since she had arrived, she looked genuinely shaken. She turned the plate over in her hands several times, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "David," Lisa said finally, her voice unusually serious, "I need to ask you again. Where exactly did you buy this car? Do you have any paperwork from the sale? Any information about the previous owner's name or background?" The urgency in Lisa's voice made David's heart start racing. "I have the title transfer in my files inside." "Lisa, You're scaring me a little here. What's going on? Lisa sat down heavily on David's front porch steps, still holding the mysterious metal plate. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at David with an expression that was part amazement and part fear. David, I don't think this is just a regular classic car, she said slowly. Based on what I'm seeing here, I think your Mustang has a history that goes way beyond what that elderly woman told you 15 years ago. David felt his world starting to shift beneath his feet. His beloved car, the one he had driven to work every day for 15 years, the one he had spent countless weekends polishing and maintaining, apparently had secrets that he never could have imagined. What kind of history? He managed to ask. Lisa looked at the plate one more time, then back at David. The kind that was supposed to stay buried forever. The silence on David's front porch stretched for what felt like forever. Lisa sat there holding that mysterious metal plate, staring at it like it might disappear if she looked away. David could see her hands trembling slightly, and the color had completely drained from her face. Whatever this plate meant to her, it was clearly much more than just an interesting discovery. Lisa, David said gently, sitting down beside her on the porch steps. You look like you've seen a ghost. What's really going on here? Lisa took a deep breath and set the plate down carefully on the step between them. For the first time since she had arrived, she seemed to struggle with finding the right words. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if she was having an internal debate about how much to reveal. David, I haven't been completely honest with you about who I am, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean, I am a mechanic, and I do good work, but that's not the whole story. David felt his stomach tighten. What do you mean? Lisa stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the street as if she was gathering courage from somewhere deep inside. I'm a veteran, David. I served to tours overseas in Afghanistan. My job was motor transport operations, which is a fancy way of saying I kept military vehicles running in some pretty difficult conditions. This revelation hit David like a surprise punch. He had never would have guessed that this quiet, professional woman had served in combat zones. She seemed so calm and peaceful, not at all like the stereotypes he had in his mind about soldiers. I came back home about 4 years ago, Lisa continued, still facing away from him. And let me tell you, the transition wasn't easy. The noise, the crowds, the constant feeling like something bad was about to happen. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't even go to the grocery store without feeling overwhelmed. David wanted to say something supportive, but he sensed that Lisa needed to tell this story in her own way, at her own pace. My counselor at the VA hospital suggested I find something to do with my hands, something that would keep my mind busy, but also give me a sense of accomplishment. That's when I started working on engines again, but this time for regular people instead of military vehicles. Lisa turned back toward David, and he could see tears starting to form in her eyes. Working on cars became my therapy, David. Every engine I fixed was like putting a little piece of myself back together. It helped me find some peace after everything I had seen and done over there. She picked up the metal plate again, holding it like it was made of fragile glass. But this changes everything. This plate, these numbers and codes, they're not random. I've seen markings like this before. During my service, they're military identifiers, David, specifically. They're from a program that operated during the Vietnam War. David's mind was racing. Vietnam War? But that was decades before I was even born. How could my car be connected to something that old? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Lisa said, sitting back down beside him. During my deployments, we had briefings about military equipment that had gone missing over the years. Vehicles, weapons, supplies that were supposed to be accounted for, but somehow ended up in places they shouldn't be. She pointed to specific markings on the plate. These codes match a series one remember from one of those briefings. They were talking about civilian vehicles that had been used for military operations and then disappeared from official records. David stared at his Mustang. Sitting in the driveway, it looked so normal, so innocent. Just a classic red car that he had loved and cared for. How could it possibly be connected to military secrets from before he was born? But there's something else, Lisa continued, and David could hear the emotion building in her voice. Something personal that makes this discovery even more complicated for me. Lisa walked back to her truck and returned with a small cardboard box that David hadn't noticed before. She set it down on the porch and carefully opened it, revealing old photographs, documents, and what looked like military papers. My grandfather was a soldier in Vietnam, she said, pulling out a faded black and white photograph. His name was Robert, and he was a motor pool sergeant. That means he was in charge of maintaining and tracking military vehicles during the war. She handed David the photograph, and his breath caught in his throat. The picture showed a young man in military uniform standing next to a car that looked almost identical to David's Mustang. Same body style, same general appearance, even what appeared to be the same color. Though it was hard to tell in the old black and white photo. My grandfather came back from Vietnam a changed man, Lisa continued, her voice growing softer. He never talked much about his service, but my grandmother used to tell me that he would have nightmares and would sometimes just sit in his garage for hours, staring at nothing. David studied the photograph more closely. The resemblance to his car was uncanny, but he told himself it could just be a coincidence. There were probably thousands of Mustangs that looked similar from that era. Before my grandfather died last year, he made me promise something, Lisa said, taking the photograph back and looking at it with sad eyes. He gave me this box of his military papers and photos, things he had kept hidden in his closet for over 50 years. He made me swear that if I ever encountered anything that seemed connected to his service, I would try to find out the truth about what really happened. Lisa pulled out another document from the box, this one more official looking with military letterhead and official stamps, according to these papers. My grandfather was responsible for a small fleet of civilian cars that were used for special operations in Vietnam. Cars that were supposed to be stripped of their identities and given new ones for security purposes. David felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of special operations? The documents don't give many details, but it sounds like they were used for undercover work. Soldiers who needed to blend in with civilian populations or for transportation that wouldn't immediately be recognized as military. Lisa's hands were shaking again as she continued reading from the document. But here's the thing that haunts me, David, according to official military records. All of these civilian vehicles were supposed to be destroyed or returned to service. After the war ended, none of them were supposed to end up in private hands. She looked up at David with eyes full of pain and confusion. My grandfather's private notes tell a different story, though. He wrote about how some of these cars mysteriously disappeared from the motor pool, and how questions about their whereabouts were quickly shut down by higher-ranking officers. David could barely process what he was hearing. Are you saying you think my car is one of those vehicles? I think it's possible, Lisa replied. And if it is, then my grandfather carried guilt about this secret his entire life. He felt responsible for not speaking up about what he suspected was happening. Even though he was just following orders, Lisa carefully placed all the documents back in the box, then picked up the metal plate one more time. David, I think this plate is going to help us uncover a piece of history that was supposed to stay buried forever. But I need to warn you, once we start digging into this, we might discover things that are going to change how you think about your car, and maybe even how you think about some parts of our country's history. David looked at his beloved Mustang, then back at Lisa. His simple car repair had suddenly become something much bigger and much more complicated than he ever could have imagined. But despite his fear and confusion, he knew there was only one thing he could do. Lisa, he said firmly, I need to know the truth. Whatever it is, I need to know. Over the next 3 weeks, David's quiet suburban life turned into something that felt like a detective story. Every evening after work, he would find Lisa sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by old documents, photocopies, and her laptop computer. She had thrown herself into researching the mystery of his Mustang with the same intensity she had shown while fixing the engine. The first breakthrough came when Lisa managed to decode the numbers on the metal plate they had found, using her grandfather's military documents and some online databases for veterans. She discovered that the numbers matched a specific vehicle identification system that had been used for classified operations during the late 1960s. "David, look at this," Lisa said one evening, pointing to her laptop screen. "I found a reference to this exact code sequence in one of my grandfather's handwritten notes. He wrote down the identification numbers of 12 different civilian vehicles that came through his motor pool in 1968 and 1969. David leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen. There, in faded pencil handwriting, was a list of numbers and vehicle descriptions. One entry made his heart skip a beat. 1967 Mustang, red, convertible top removed. The numbers next to it were an exact match for the code on the metal plate. "That's my car," David whispered, hardly believing what he was seeing. "That's actually my car." But Lisa had found something even more disturbing in her grandfather's notes. According to his records, that particular Mustang had been assigned to a soldier named Lieutenant James Patterson. The notes indicated that Patterson had been using the car for undercover operations in and around Saigon, blending in with American civilian contractors and embassy workers. "Here's where it gets really strange," Lisa said, flipping through more documents. "According to the official military casualty reports I found online, Lieutenant James Patterson was killed in action in Vietnam in September 1969. But my grandfather's notes suggest something completely different." Lisa showed David a handwritten entry dated 3 months after Patterson's supposed death. The note was brief but shocking. "JP vehicle returned to motor pool. Driver status unclear. Questions not welcomed by command." David felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you think that means?" "I think it means Patterson didn't die when the official records say he did," Lisa replied, her voice full of concern. "And I think someone wanted people to believe he was dead when he actually wasn't." The next part of their investigation took them to the local library, where Lisa had arranged to use their genealogy research computers. She was determined to find out what had really happened to Lieutenant Patterson, and more importantly, how his car had ended up at the estate sale where David bought it 15 years ago. After hours of searching through public records, obituaries, and property transfers, Lisa finally found what she was looking for. James Patterson had indeed lived well beyond 1969, but not under his original identity. The records showed that a man named James Porter had purchased property in a small town in Oregon in 1971, just 2 years after Patterson's supposed death. "In Vietnam, look at this, David," Lisa said, pointing to the property records on the computer screen. "Same initials, similar name. And the timeline fits perfectly. I think Patterson came back from Vietnam and changed his identity." Further research revealed that James Porter had lived quietly in Oregon for nearly 40 years, working as a mechanic and keeping mostly to himself. He had never married, had no children, and seemed to have deliberately avoided any activities that might draw attention to his past. The most heartbreaking discovery came when Lisa found James Porter's obituary from 2008. The brief notice mentioned that he had died at age 62 after a long illness, and that his only surviving relative was a nephew who lived in California. The obituary also mentioned that Porter had been a Vietnam veteran, but gave no details about his service. "David," Lisa said softly, "I think we found our answer. James Patterson became James Porter, and he kept your Mustang his entire life. The estate sale you went to 15 years ago was probably when his nephew was selling off Porter's belongings." David sat back in his chair, trying to process everything they had discovered. But why would he change his identity? And why would the military report him as dead if he wasn't? Lisa had been wondering the same thing, and she had a theory that made David's stomach turn. "Based on what I know about that time period and the kind of operations my grandfather was involved in, I think Patterson might have been involved in something that the military wanted to keep secret." Maybe he saw something or knew something. That made it easier for everyone if he just disappeared. That evening, David sat in his garage staring at the Mustang with completely different eyes. This wasn't just his beloved classic car anymore. It was a piece of living history, a connection to a man who had been forced to erase his own identity and live in hiding for 40 years. Lisa, David said as she packed up her research materials. Do you think Patterson kept the car all those years because it was his only connection to who he used to be? Lisa paused in her packing and looked at the car thoughtfully. I think that's exactly why he kept it. And I think that's why he never modified it or changed anything about it. It was like keeping a piece of his old life alive, even though he could never go back to being that person. The weight of this realization settled over both of them. They weren't just solving a mystery about a car anymore. They were uncovering the hidden story of a man who had sacrificed his entire identity, possibly to protect military secrets, or maybe just to survive something that had gone terribly wrong during the war. So what do we do now? David asked. Lisa closed her laptop and looked at him with determination in her eyes. Now we try to find Patterson's nephew. I think he deserves to know the truth about his uncle, and maybe he can help us understand what really happened during those missing years. David nodded. Knowing that their investigation was far from over, they had answered some questions, but they had also uncovered new mysteries that demanded answers. The story of Lieutenant James Patterson was just beginning to unfold, and David realized that his simple car repair had connected him to a piece of American history that someone had tried very hard to erase. As Lisa drove away that night, David walked back into his garage and ran his hand along the Mustang's hood. What secrets are you still hiding? He whispered to the car. And what am I going to do when I find out? Finding Patterson's nephew turned out to be easier than David and Lisa had expected. His name was Michael Porter, and he was living in San Diego, working as a high school history teacher. When Lisa called him and explained what they had discovered, there was a long silence on the phone before Michael spoke. I always knew there was something different about Uncle Jim, Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. He never talked about his time in Vietnam, and whenever anyone asked, he would just change the subject. My mom always said there were parts of his life that seemed like they were missing. Michael agreed to meet with them the following weekend. He drove up from San Diego with a box of his uncle's belongings that he had never known what to do with. When he arrived at David's house, the family resemblance was immediately clear. Michael had the same quiet intensity that David imagined his uncle must have possessed. I brought everything I could find that might be helpful, Michael said, setting the box down on David's kitchen table. After Uncle Jim died, I kept meaning to go through this stuff, but it always felt too personal, like I was invading his privacy. The contents of the box were like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting 15 years to be solved. There were old photographs, including several of a young man in military uniform standing next to the same red Mustang that now sat in David's garage. There were also letters, documents, and a journal that James had apparently kept during his years living as James Porter. As they went through the materials together, a heartbreaking story began to emerge. According to the journal entries, Patterson had been wounded during a classified operation in Vietnam and had spent months in a military hospital. During his recovery, he had been approached by military intelligence officers who told him that his death had been officially reported to protect both him and the operation he had been involved in. Listen to this, Lisa said, reading from one of the journal entries. They told me it was temporary, just until things cooled down. They said I could go back to my old life in a few months, maybe a year at most, but months turned into years. And every time I asked about going back, they said it still wasn't safe. David felt his anger building as Lisa continued reading. By the time I realized they were never going to let me return to being James Patterson, it was too late. Everyone I had known thought I was dead. My parents had buried an empty coffin. My girlfriend had married someone else. There was no life left for me to go back to. Michael wiped tears from his eyes as he listened to his uncle's words. That explains so much about him. He always seemed like he was carrying this terrible sadness but he never let anyone get close enough to help him. The journal revealed that James had chosen the name Porter because it was close enough to Patterson that he wouldn't forget to respond to it, but different enough that it wouldn't trigger recognition from anyone who might have known him before. He had deliberately chosen to live in a small town where no one would ask too many questions about his past. But the most touching discovery was what James had written about the Mustang. Entry after entry described how working on the car was the only thing that made him feel connected to who he used to be. He had kept it in perfect condition not just because he loved cars, but because it was his only remaining link to Lieutenant James Patterson. I can't sell it, and I can't drive it very often because it draws too much attention, one entry read. But just knowing it's there in my garage makes me feel like that part of my life wasn't completely erased. Sometimes I sit in it and remember what it felt like to be young and believe that I was fighting for something important. As they continued reading, David and Lisa learned that James had never stopped hoping that someday he would be able to reclaim his real identity. He had kept copies of his military records, his birth certificate, and even letters from his family, hidden away in the hope that the day would come when he could safely become James Patterson again. That day never came. The journal's final entries, written just months before his death, revealed a man who had spent 40 years in exile from his own life, watching the world change while he remained frozen in time as someone he was never meant to be. "We have to do something with this information," David said after they had finished going through all the materials. "This man's story shouldn't die with him. People should know what happened." Michael nodded in agreement. Uncle Jim always talked about how important it was for people to understand the real cost of war. Not just the battles and the politics, but what it did to individual lives. I think he would want his story to be told. Over the next month, the three of them worked together to document everything they had discovered. Lisa used her connections in the veteran community to verify the military records and confirm the details of James's service. Michael contributed family history and personal memories that helped fill in the gaps in the story. David made the decision that felt right in his heart. He couldn't keep driving the Mustang knowing what it had meant to James Patterson. Instead, he wanted to ensure that both the car and James's story would be preserved for future generations. They contacted the National Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund and explained what they had discovered. The organization was fascinated by the story and agreed to accept the Mustang as a donation, along with all the documentation they had assembled about James Patterson's life and service. The day they delivered the car to the Memorial Museum was both sad and uplifting for David, as he handed over the keys for the last time. He felt like he was finally allowing James Patterson to come home after 40 years of exile. The museum created a special exhibit around the Mustang, telling the complete story of Lieutenant James Patterson and the secret life he had been forced to live as James Porter. The display included photographs, documents, and excerpts from his journal, showing visitors not just the car, but the human story behind it. At the exhibit's opening ceremony, David and Lisa were approached by an elderly man who introduced himself as Robert Wilson, a Vietnam veteran who had served in the same unit as James Patterson. "I always wondered what happened to Jimmy," Robert said, tears streaming down his face. "One day he was there, and the next day they told us he had been killed in action. But something about it never felt right. I'm glad to finally know the truth, even though it's not the ending any of us would have wanted for him." 6 months later, Michael received a call from the Army's casualty office. Based on the evidence that David and Lisa had uncovered, the military was officially correcting James Patterson's records. His death certificate was being voided, and his family would finally receive the recognition and benefits that had been denied to them for over 50 years. David sometimes visits the museum to see the Mustang and read the letters that visitors leave at the exhibit. Many are from veterans who understand the price that James Patterson paid, and from families who have their own unanswered questions about loved ones who served in Vietnam. Lisa continues to work as a mechanic, but she has also become an advocate for veterans' rights and military transparency. The experience of uncovering James Patterson's story helped her find a new sense of purpose and healing from her own service experiences. As for David, he bought another classic car to work on, but he has never forgotten the lesson that his Mustang taught him. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're just trying to fix something simple. And sometimes the greatest honor we can give someone is to make sure their story doesn't get lost to history. The red 1967 Mustang now sits in the museum as a symbol not just of American automotive history, but of the hidden cost of war and the importance of never forgetting the individual human stories behind the headlines and statistics.